Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning of winter morning to you all. I know that various folks have no internet right now. I hope you're finding a way to join, and if not, of course, this talk will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in a few hours' time. So for those of you who can't join us, you can't even hear me say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. The talk will be on our YouTube channel, and it's a great way, clicking a button on YouTube to subscribe to our channel just puts an automatic notice into your email box that there's a new video. So I encourage you to do so, and I'll put our YouTube link into your into the chat box so that you can see and join very quickly our YouTube extravaganza. So today is our final pop-up talk that we're offering to the entire community. Going forward, this is going to be an exclusive benefit for CIR members. So if you ever needed another reason to join CIR at the super low cost of beginning at $50 a year, please do so. And we want to have as many pop-up talks as we can do over the next little while, because there's so much going on and there's so much to understand. And I think we all benefit from the way we can go behind the headlines in looking at the major issues shaping our country and our world today. And I sure love, coming up with talking with Vicki and others and saying, oh, in 2 days' time, why don't we do this? And it's really nice to be just so responsive to what's going on in the headlines. And obviously right now, there is a lot going on in the headlines, and there's a lot to be responsive to, and we're going to get into all kinds of issues today. So as you all know, we have lots of talks upcoming. One of the amazing things of this pandemic time is it makes it so simple to for all of us to connect and join and listen to world-renowned experts talk about all kinds of things going on. This Thursday, we have a great talk on the microwave power attacks on US diplomats and Canadian diplomats in China and Cuba. And we're going to hear from two really special guests that day, in addition to, of course, Ambassador Huddleston, who led US diplomatic missions in Cuba. Next Thursday, the 28th, we're going to dip into President Biden's foreign policy priorities, featuring the one and only Todd Greentree, who we'll hear from in a couple of minutes. On Tuesday, February the 2nd, we have a collaborative talk with the Santa Fe Institute called The Avalanche of Violence. This is open right now for registration to our $150 members and up. Again, it's a sort of a perk of membership. We will be opening this to the general public and all of the CIR members on Monday the 25th, so stay tuned for that one. Among other things, we're going to have the great Rachel Kleinfeld talking about a lot of her work on violence, and then, of course, intersecting with the three SFI researchers, including the head of SFI, who will join us for that talk. Thursday, February 4th, we're going to go to Saudi Arabia and look at human rights issues there. And we're featuring the director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, which is a group based in DC, and its director, Ali Aliami. Couple more points before I stop talking. Our Great Decisions discussion series. If you haven't participated in these before, there are 8 discussions that are all build upon work by the Foreign Policy Association of America, who sends us a booklet and videos in advance of each session. So join us for those. The first one will be on February the 9th, which is a Tuesday. The regular slot for Great Decisions will be 10 a.m. on Tuesdays. And the first one will be about the melting of the Arctic and what that means for all the fun geopolitical and trade considerations. And we'll have Rich Moriarty, who's on today's call, lead that discussion. And these are discussion groups. So as opposed to today, which is more of a webinar and listening to experts, Great Decisions groups will have about 20 minutes of a presentation and a moderated discussion, and then your turn to offer your comments, your thoughts, your questions. So it's a bit of a different format. It's always been great fun to do so. And this year there's 8 different topics. They're on our website, and I'll send out all the details tomorrow in our news digest. And lastly, on Wednesday, February 10th, which is right after Great Decisions launch, we'll feature the one and only Brad Allenby, who is a professor at Arizona State University. He is one of the greatest intellects I have ever met in my life, and he'll be speaking about all kinds of things related to information and the way we produce and consume information in this age. And knowing Brad, he's going to pull on all kinds of things across the millennia. So stay tuned for that. So that is all from me. And now I am going to bring in today's speakers and introduce them one by one. So here we have, there's 4 of us on screen now. So I'll start with saying the following remark, which is, Even though we have some CIR board members on today's call, this is not a position statement of CIR on any of these issues, and the speakers are representing their own perspectives and not that of CIR. So first, we have Chuck Case, who is our CIR board president, and he is, of course, a retired federal bankruptcy judge. Then we have Dr. Todd Greentree, who is a historian, an author, a presenter extraordinaire, someone I'm constantly trying to stump by asking him really hard questions about the world, and he never fails, which is agonizing, but the man knows some things. And then we have Rich Moriarty. Rich is a former assistant attorney general in Wisconsin and truly knows matters related to rule of law like no one I've ever met. And we're thrilled to have you three here. And of course, last and never least is today's moderator and guider, Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, who of course led 4 US diplomatic missions around the world. And so Vicki, why don't I just turn the proceedings right over to you?
Thank you, Sandy. And I'm sorry for people who are missing this, but as Sandy says, for sure you can listen on the recording at another time. I just want to say, whew, we made it by the skin of our teeth, or at least in 24 hours. Had it not been for coronavirus, in my opinion, we most likely would be inaugurating President Trump to another 4 years. And we probably would also be losing our democracy because at this point, President Trump has in place in most of our departments, our cabinet, loyalists. And so the question is, what happened? And I would say it was coronavirus, just like in time immemorial. If a ruler lost the confidence of the people because of bad crops, an earthquake, flooding, then they might rise up and throw him out. Well, I think it was the coronavirus because the response of the Trump administration was incompetent. And the irony of this is, to me, that President Trump loved to have the power, but he never wanted to really govern. But we stand in jeopardy, I believe, because another demagogue, more competent, could very easily really overcome our democracy if we are not very, very cautious in the future. So this morning, I'm turning it over to these superb panelists, and I'm going to begin with Todd Greentree because I want to talk first and foremost about the insurrection at the Capitol because it seems to me that these insurrectionists, right wing, various groups, do they have, I don't know, what is their philosophy? I've never seen anything written. Why are they so attached, Todd, to the president when in many cases it seems to me that might be against their own interests? So, can you help us out on this?
Unmute. Let me say, first of all, hello, Santa Fe from Amman, Jordan. So your morning, my evening. Let me just take a minute to try to put this whole thing in context. And I think it is important to pay attention to this event and try to get what we can out of its significance because of how it reflects on everything else that we've been experiencing and what the potential future of Donald Trump and sort of what he represents means. So this reflection is based on 40 plus years of experience around the world, most of which were in back and beyond countries in some kind of civil conflict, war, revolution. And I never really thought I'd be talking about this in relation to the United States. But that's the language. The language I'm going to use is from that, and I think it fits very well. So what we're talking about here is a challenge. This event culminating in the seizure of the Capitol building represents a violent challenge to civil order. At its most extreme end, we're talking revolutions and civil wars. This event was well below that threshold, but there is one thing that all such events have in common, and that is that what they do in effect is challenge two things: one, the authority, and the other, the legitimacy of the state. And if anybody has a question, we can go into more detail about that. But the key question to ask is, what is their cause and what is their aim? So that's what I'm going to address. Let's be more specific. The contest, the struggle between democracy against tyranny is a problem as old as ancient Athens. Our founders mounted a protracted revolutionary war of independence. George Washington himself called this their insurrection, their insurgency. So the aim was freedom from British tyranny, and their cause was democracy. Very clear. So what were these people about? Well, the most common references that you hear are insurrection and coup. So an insurrection, that's a correct designation. It is a popular uprising against government. So you can measure the impact, the size, the behavior of this group with reference to insurrection. Calling it a coup was not exactly right. That's because a coup is the extra legal removal of a leader in power and replacement with another. So Fiona Hill got it right in Politico this week when she called it a self-coup. That's taken from the Spanish autogolpe. And this is something with a long, long history. And in the modern era, there's dozens of examples. So the difference is it's an extra legal effort to keep yourself in power. And that's what this was. So the event itself ransacked a center of our democracy and of power, attacked police, and threatened to kidnap and possibly take hostage the vice president and members of Congress. That's what the insurrection did. From my point of view, this was a shock. We can all agree with that, but it was not a surprise. I think that we can just think of it as the violent culmination of 4 years of political trauma and subversion, which is the major impact of the president, who himself is a demagogue. He was unconstitutional. He was conspiratorial, even criminal, and ultimately nihilistic, in the sense that he was not trying to create anything. He was merely serving his own personality disorder, which was been labeled malignant narcissism. And his cause was his self. So he didn't really have an aim. His aim was nihilistic, and his cause was his own self. Important to keep in mind here that he had, not only did he have major public support, he also was enabled by the Republican Party on the back of 3+ decades of political dysfunction that has corroded our democratic practices and our norms. All right, so quickly, who were these guys? Who is QAnon, Boogaloo, Proud Boys, neo-Nazis? What can you say about them? So there are certain elements that feature more or less in each one, these sort of as motivating factors: white supremacy, racism, hyper-patriotism, evangelism. But none of these labels make them revolutionaries. I think one of the best things I heard them called was they were lumpen Trumpists. in the traditional sense of lumpen, as meaning people who, the old Marxist term, they're not really aware of what they're doing in a revolutionary way. So to give them a label, I think extreme rightists works fine for the whole group, in the same way that you identify extreme Islamists. So their characteristics, they have a warped vision of the political realm. They are backward looking, not forward looking. Their fundamental emotional orientation is disaffection, grievances, hatred. And in that sense, they're a reflection of the president, of Trump. They are entirely negative. There is although there is some elements of organization, they are by no means unified. And critically, they're not coherent in the sense that there's no ideology. They don't have a cause or an aim. And if you want an illustration of that, look at what they did after they seized the Capitol. Nothing. They sat at Nancy Pelosi's desk. They tore up a bunch of furniture. They didn't do a damn thing. They didn't have any idea what they were supposed to do. So just to wrap that up, I think what we're looking at is a deeply irrational manifestation of collective delusion. And it's based on a fictional reality that the president has created over the past 4 years. Fictional reality is worth meditating on. What does that mean? Stop the steal was their theme. What steal? We know the elections weren't stolen, just like we know climate change really exists, just like we know that the pandemic is not going to disappear by itself, that there is no deep state, that hoaxes and witch hunts, and Trump wasn't a victim. He was the most powerful person in the world. And I can talk about this later, but there was a term for that wraps it all up, and that's the big lie, which the author of that being Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda.
So Todd, tell us what you really think.
Yeah.
That's my objective analysis.
Would any of you like to comment on some of Todd's points? I guess the thing that always bothers me is why people act against their own interests. Most of these people need Medicare or Medicaid. Most of these people need Social Security, and yet they're very happy to support Trump's program, which basically helps people who are wealthy.
Well, my thought about that, Vicki, is not original. It's not with me. It's from Isabel Wilkerson, who recently wrote a book called Caste, which is her follow-up book to The Warmth of Other Suns. And her premise is that many people's interests are determined in the United States by where they are in the caste system, with the caste system being not exactly systemic racism, but nevertheless, racial differences are something that define them. So she has a number of stories in her book about people who basically express that their primary interest is maintaining their position in the caste system. In other words, being higher than the lowest members of the caste system, and that is more important to them than the kind of material interests that you just talked about. And one of them is quoted in this book as saying, it's more important to me, I will support this cause, or I'll support President Trump, even if it means I don't get things like healthcare, and even if it means that I die. And in fact, this particular person did die because he did not have access to health care because of policies that were against his material interest, but not against his perceived position in the caste. So it's a book I recommend to people. It's certainly not uncontroversial, but it's very thoughtful and very very descriptive of the situation that we're in today.
I'm
But
wondering.
just to take just a quick note on what Chuck said. The interesting thing is that on the caste system issue, go to Thucydides, 5th century BC, in which he talks in great detail at several instances about the threat that demagogues pose because they're able to mobilize the populi. But his real problem is the fact that there are oligarchs, as he calls them, behind the demagogue who are ready to take advantage of that. So they are people who are making use of people who act against their own interests for their purposes, and I think we've seen plenty of that.
Nothing new
And
on-
that, that is I think the distinction, the oligarchs behind Trump, has been the problem, I think, during his term, and then would have been the problem had he become president. I kind of wonder if Trump really wasn't so much an autocrat himself as an autocrat groupie. Somebody, think of his love letters to Kim. And like many groupies, he didn't play any instrument very well, but he was not an astute and effective autocrat. And had he been, it could well be he, rather than Biden, would be inaugurated tomorrow. And I think Vicki was right, going back to what she was saying, that it was the pandemic that results in who we will be inaugurating tomorrow. Some folks say, oh, well, look at how Trump responded to the racial reckoning. And, he blew that. No, I actually see that as Trump's response to the racial reckoning after the Floyd murder having been viewed by a majority of the country as a cause to move towards Trump. Had the pandemic not occurred, and more importantly, had Trump effectively responded to the pandemic, then we would be seeing quite a different situation. I have some remarks also I want to chat about with the Defense Production Act, but I'll wait on those until later, Vicki.
Well, I was going to ask you, excuse me, I was going to ask you in any case, Rich, about what might have happened, and I know it's speculative, if Trump had stayed in power. Because I think indeed, like you're saying, we have come very, very close.
Mhm.
And maybe it will help us if we know what he might have done to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Because as far as I
Yep.
can see, it could certainly happen again.
If Trump, in my view, if Trump were being inaugurated tomorrow and had 4 years, we'd have 4 more years of the craziness we've seen. But what Todd said, I think, hits the nail on the head. It's the oligarchs behind Trump and the anti-democratic forces behind Trump that would make the next 4 years really dangerous. We would see any number of changes made. First and foremost, voter suppression efforts would be far more sophisticated than they were this year to assure future elections kept them in control. It kept the anti-democratic forces and the oligarchs in control. They wouldn't allow, and we now have, in fact, a great fear and a great concern about that, because the majority of state legislatures that will be determining both redistricting and how voter laws will take place will be controlled by Republicans. So we will see a lot of efforts to suppress votes. Beyond that, it would be a continuation of what we've seen, but in a far more dark term, I think, for democracy. We survived this 4 years with a lot of people being shocked, but at post-pandemic, we would be, I think the next 4 years, we would be seeing a locking up of the anti-democratic movement.
I want to go back just for a minute to the book that Todd, or not the book, the article that Todd mentioned by Fiona Hill. And she talks about this autogolpe, or the self-coup, but she goes back to the beginning. And that, she says, if I'm right, this is what you have to look at. What happened to defense? What happened to justice? What happened to the State Department and the intelligence agencies? Because in each of those cases, Trump began to subvert them. Comment? Yes, no?
Yeah, my response on that in relation to what if we get 4 more years is that the thing that saved us this time, if you can say such a thing, was, one was time. There's a reason why the president's term is 4 years, so you can have a transfer of power. But the thing that really saved us was incompetence. And if this group had been competent and organized, the damage they would have done would have been much greater. For me, usually I like to focus on international stuff. Pompeo as the Secretary of State, the worst Secretary of State, I think by counting now. And the reversal of everything. Instead of making America great again, America is weaker in the world after 4 years. 8 years of it, 8 years of continued incompetence would almost certainly have dragged us into one of those awful wars, not by overreaching in ambition, but by sheer error and miscalculation.
I'd like to turn to the subject of who pays, and I'm going to ask Chuck about that, because you have a Republican Party that's now divided, presumably or seemingly between those who still support the president and those who want to move forward. So should Ted Cruz be allowed to stay in Congress? Should Senator Hawley be allowed to stay in Congress? What kind of reckoning should we have, and should we impose, if we can, upon the Republican Party for this insurrection? Chuck?
Well, removing a member from Congress is certainly possible. You can be expelled, but the bar is very high. I believe it's 2/3 to expel a member from Congress. We are going to see in the next few weeks whether there are 2/3 of the senators who wish to convict Trump, but I'd find it very, very unlikely that there would be 2/3 of either house that would be willing to expel members from the House, because in politics, it's always about yourself, in effect. And if they can do it to him, they could do it to me. And it seems to me unlikely. Now, the one thing that you can do, if you remember the circumstances of the Iowa Congressman, Steve King, who was often excoriated for racist statements and things, his committee assignments were stripped. He was basically made a non-entity within Congress, and eventually left, was replaced. That is certainly something that can be done, and that does not require a 2/3 expulsion, as far as I'm aware. So it's hard to say. Obviously, both Hawley and Cruz made the calculation that taking the positions they did with regard to uh, approving the Electoral College results for Biden were in their long-term political interest. They figured they would come out better on the other end than if they didn't do that. Both are, suffer from the disease of raw ambition to a very high degree. Now, we don't know whether that's true or not. And we know what happened when Ted Cruz ran for president the first time. He didn't do very well. And I think he won Iowa, if I remember, and then he kind of went straight downhill from there. So I guess we won't know until the next cycle starts whether or not they made the right political determination. And we will see that again in the Senate when the Senate decides finally has a trial, because the real question obviously is not whether Trump will be removed, because by then he will be gone. The real question will be whether or not he'll be barred from ever running for any elected office again. And the irony is that it takes 67 senators, or 2/3 of those voting, actually is the more correct way to put it, to convict him. Normally the result then would be expulsion, but he's already expelled. But then it only takes a majority after that to bar him from running for office again. So really the issue that's going to be presented in the political minds of the senators, it seems to me, is whether or not they feel that they will be better off and that the Republican Party will be better off if Trump is with them or gone, barred or not barred. And that may have, while that is not a fact-based determination or a law-based determination, as more and more facts of what actually occurred and who was behind it become known, there may be more political pressure on other senators to convict. And certainly what McConnell decides to do could lead members of his flock along with him. Now, the other question is whether or not there's any criminal liability. And I haven't really studied this. Maybe Rich would have an idea on this, but as a general rule, senators, people in legislative roles have a certain amount of immunity from the consequences of their action under our system. Whether or not that extends to, if it's fine, for example, if there's concrete evidence that one of these folks actually was one of the organizers of the incitement that led to the sacking of the Capitol or the taking of the Capitol, would they be subject to criminal liability for that? That's an open question in my mind, but I think it's interesting.
On that, the speech and debate clause would preclude criminal prosecution for statements made on the floor or in the Capitol itself, etc. But if there's evidence of social media contacts or other organizational contacts, that could lead to criminal things. I do differ with you a bit on whether representatives and senators may be expelled. I think what will happen first is the impeachment trial, and we'll see the lay of the land. And there's a lot that can happen between now and then, but we'll see the lay of the land as far as the Republican support thereof. But I suspect we will ultimately have the House at a minimum moving against certain select representatives, someone like a Mo Brooks, as opposed to anyone that might have been involved. If only as a signal, don't ever think of doing this again. And it wouldn't be viewed as political, because if Mo Brooks were, for example, expelled, the voters of his district would respond by electing a Republican. Ted Cruz is an interesting concept. He has long been known as the least popular senator in the Senate itself amongst his colleagues. So he doesn't have many friends. Could be that he'll be involved, particularly with the videos coming out showing, hey, if these papers are great, Cruz will really like this. People were responding to that. So you could easily have some examples being made. Even if they're unsuccessful, ultimately, it would send a message. And
Well,
censure, of course,
it seems to me the thing to do that's much more likely is to marginalize them through committee assignments or
Yep.
other kinds of political or positions in political leadership or something like that.
And I think that will
I
occur.
remain
Yep.
pretty doubtful that there is enough to expel even the Mo Brookses and the Paul Gosars and the Andy Biggses and the rest of them, because I mean, just look how many of the Republican caucus signed on to the lawsuit that was filed by Paxton in the Supreme Court. There's a lot of true believers there.
Yeah, Chuck, that was then, and this is now.
Well, I know that. I just don't see that. I don't see them turning on their own so easily because it can be turned back against them. But who knows? We'll find out.
Yeah.
So I just want to comment on this, the sort of that divide between who should pay the price, punishment, and Rich's point, where Rich came off and said, but don't ever think about doing this again. So the bridge there of capturing that, most of what Chuck and Rich are talking about is finding political accountability, but this issue of criminal, I think, is equally important. And that in a way, if you're talking about how do you put this Humpty Dumpty back together again, the US democracy has an extremely strong system of justice and laws. I think this is definitely a time for strong justice against those who can be charged and convicted of having committed crimes. And that ranges from the failure of civil order that occurred as faults by law enforcement members. If there was and there is some evidence of conspiratorial actions by them, and all the way up, and this is far too much of a reach, but the president, publicly committed sedition. He incited his supporters to commit acts of violent insurrection. That is a crime, and I just think that's that strong justice is definitely called for in the moment as a way of getting out of this.
2 points on that, Todd. Number one is there's this interesting defense that is already being raised by a number of the insurrectionists, which is, heck, we were there because the president told us. We were doing what the president told us to do. And there is, although my background is not in criminal law, there is a defense that you can raise, which is to say a person in authority told me it was okay to do this. And so that basically runs against the idea of having an intent to break the law rather than an intent to follow what the leader tells me to do. And the flip side of that, of course, is that if that is accepted, then that increases Trump's culpability. It kind of lets the actual insiders more off the hook, and it raises the stakes for Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how that's played out. But a lot of the lawyers for the individuals are saying that. You can hear them saying that on the tapes that were recorded and the videos that were recorded during the capture of the Capitol itself. The other thing that I think is interesting here is the Trump administration. Trump issued an executive order after the Black Lives Matter uprisings or protests during the summer. And some of the language of that is, it is the policy of the United States to prosecute to the fullest extent permitted under federal law any person or any entity that destroys, damages, vandalizes, or desecrates or vandalizes government property. Now that was related to monuments, but the language certainly is the same, and the desire of Congress to protect federal property, i.e. the Capitol building, is found in section 1361 of Title 18 of the US Code. And then it says, this is interesting, it is the policy of the United States signed by Donald Trump to prosecute to the full extent permitted under federal law any person or entity that participates in efforts to incite violence or other illegal activity in connection with the acts of vandalism described in section 1 of this order. That may come home to roost because it's pretty strong language, and it doesn't just say, oh, this only applies if this was during the June Black Lives Matter protest, but it's pretty broad. So there are a couple of things. First, this defense that the boss told me to do it, therefore it's okay. I parked in the parking spot because the chief of police.
Uh-oh. Let me jump in with, if he's locked up, that the official told me to do it defense, I think is a perfectly understandable one for those folks to raise. But I think it'll go the way of the Twinkie defense. That would not succeed in this situation. On Trump's culpability also, the focus of a prosecutor will not just be on that speech that day. They will look at his MO throughout the prior year and all of the things he's said, and the fact that he has said it, the same type of thing over and over. There was a terrific thing in the Washington Post about a week ago that went through all the statements he's made over the last year that are similar. And I could almost see that as the opening statement of a prosecutor in a criminal trial. He said this, then he said this, then he said this. I do think, absent a self-pardon that actually holds, Trump could be looking at criminal liability.
Which may bring us to pardons. And maybe while we've been talking,
Yes.
there has been a self-pardon. But let's jump into that and
Okay.
talk about who is Trump pardoning. What about these accusations of people paying up to $2 million for pardons? And also, will Trump pardon himself and his family? Go ahead, Rich.
I'll wait on the self-pardon just a little bit. I think that if he were, there's been talk of him pardoning the rioters, the anarchists that went into the Capitol. Certainly a lot of folks have been asking for that. I doubt that he'll do that. And it'll be for self-preservation. And basically, he is facing an impeachment trial. The public was, the polls are showing, if anything, that the public was not in favor of the rioters going into the Capitol. If he were to reach out and pardon the rioters, he'd be virtually guaranteeing, I think, being convicted in the impeachment trial. The self-pardon, that fascinating article from 1996 that went through the arguments opposed to the concept that a self-pardon is a power a president has. And I'm going to send that to Sandy to maybe do a link for good reads. It's a law review article, but very well written. Basically, the founders never talked about a self-pardon. They certainly probably didn't assume there was one, but the dialogue during the Constitutional Convention suggests there is no way they were thinking that if the subject had been something they'd thought of, they would have rejected it out of hand. The way the Constitution is written, with checks and balances, with people, no person being above the law, a number of reasons why a self-pardon would not be good. There are good arguments, on the other hand, that the other side can make, that a self-pardon is a power that a president has. So if Trump should pardon himself, it will go to the Supreme Court. There's no doubt about that, unless a prosecutor fails to prosecute, and I don't see that happening.
Right. I mean, the thing about it is that that a pardon is in the nature of an affirmative defense. So the issue does not become ripe for litigation unless and until somebody charges a person who has received a pardon, and that person and the defendant says, well, you can't prosecute me even if I'm guilty because I've been pardoned. And the prosecutor says, yeah, but that prospective pardon or that pardon was a self-pardon, doesn't work. Then you have a ripe issue for a court to decide. And as Rich says, that's one that has never been decided by the Supreme Court, even the prospective pardon part, and it would end up going there. So, all of this, the most famous prospective pardon, at least in recent times, of course, was Ford pardoning Nixon. But because Nixon was never charged, it was never determined whether or not you can prosecute, whether you can pardon somebody for crimes that they may have committed but have not been charged with, unspecified crimes. And basically the Ford pardon was very broad. It says anything you might have done, ever as president, you're pardoned for. And there's no such thing as a future pardon. So, I mean, if Trump kept going now, or anybody kept going now, even given a pardon and created new or committed new crimes, those would be outside the pardon. And of course, finally, the state law things are not not subject to pardon. And that includes a number of criminal statutes in the District of Columbia that are not considered federal crimes. They're municipal crimes for the District of Columbia. And they include things like incitement to riot and all of the same sort of thing. They're vandalizing property. So, and the DC prosecutor, based on public reports, seems quite willing and interested in pursuing whether or not a case can be made for those.
Well, we're going to
interesting
very soon. Rich, what I want to do now, I'll let you finish that thought. But then after you finish that thought, let's begin with Todd and indicate the one or two things that we would do to prevent this from happening again. Because when I began, I said that, if we had a president who was competent and a populist like Trump, we might have him for not just another term, but until he died of natural causes or something else. So go ahead with your thought, Rich.
Just a quickie on the pardons. One is people say, oh, well, it's never happened before. One interesting thing is a number of governors over the years have pardoned themselves. It's never been challenged in court. That doesn't mean that the arguments against self-pardons are any less, but it is an interesting historical fact. The other is that specificity issue, that a pardon has to be specific. I read a great article about that it must be specific, but I don't think it stands up. Just for folks to focus on, in Armstrong v. United States back in the 1880s, the Supreme Court basically said it was okay for the president to give amnesty to anyone involved in the Civil War rebellion without specificity. So I think that argument is out the window. But on the self-pardon one, boy, that is going to be a heck of a argument in front of the Supreme Court.
So Todd?
So your question is about what does the administration do to deal with these groups? Here, I think, first of all, it's a bigger problem than just the executive branch. We've been talking about the justice system. I already mentioned the need for strong justice. So there, I think that the associated issue is the need to more of a political task, something that's often, I think it's more in the realm of fantasy, but when you're talking about counterinsurgency, one of the goals of the state is to separate the people from the insurgents. In this case, I don't think that may not be a huge challenge, because in fact, like I came of age in the Vietnam era, and when I went to Washington for the moratorium, there were over 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. That was a big movement, and it was against something very concrete. There were a few thousand people who marched, and if that's an indicator of the size of the group, and the reflection in the broader sort of broader population, that may not be the problem. I think that the fact that in the end, the institutions that are charged with maintaining civil order rallied not around the president. The and here we're talking about the Department of Justice, the military, even the Congress in the end, none of the institutions supported this. So that downsizes what we're looking at here. As a persistent phenomenon, absolutely. And here there is an issue of enforcement and domestic, and I think the analogy, and it's not wrong, because the real threat is the threat of violence, and we're talking about domestic counterterrorism. So we have a very formidable counter-terrorist institutional base that has been established since 9/11. It has just been focused against Islamic jihadists. So there are any number of problems in dealing with domestic terrorists who happen to be American citizens, but the framework of thinking about it is not all that different. The core problem is we have constitutional issues, and there it's not just a First Amendment issue; it's a Second Amendment issue. That is the warping of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms to turn it into an individual right to carry weapons of any type that cannot bear restriction is a major problem when you're talking about domestic terrorism. I'll just point out from my experience around the world, but let's use Europe, let's use developed countries, where, for example, many countries like France and Great Britain, even Germany, have had the military on the streets. And it's sort of integrated into society. The idea that we might have armed military, and here I'm not talking about National Guard, I'm talking about military on the streets, would be something very, very big to swallow. But that's just merely to bring home the point that we do not really have a fully developed institutional structure for dealing with the threat of extremist violence.
Yes, and I would just add to that we perhaps should be thinking of another agency that's between the FBI and the CIA to deal with domestic terrorism, because the CIA knows how to deal with terrorism, as you mentioned, but the FBI essentially is law enforcement and does not. So if I give you each 1 minute, I think Sandy will let me do this, Rich and Chuck, what would you do? Thank you, Todd. That was excellent.
Electoral reform, number one. There's all sorts, I'd have a litany of many reforms that are needed, but electoral reform is number one, including reinvigorating the Voting Rights Act, having a law that is passed by Congress tied to the spending clause to avoid constitutional problems with forcing states to do things. A law that says voter suppression issues, stop it. Don't do it. Get rid of what you got. Don't do future ones. And it's tied to money you're getting. Do you accept this state? You do? Fine. You've got to get rid of voter suppression laws. And this has to be done pretty quick because the Democrats now have control. A disclosure act. Citizens United terrible decision, but it's based on the First Amendment. Its core cannot be changed. You cannot repeal by law Citizens United, but Citizens United, the Citizens United decisions allows for full disclosure requirements. Congress, for unknown reasons, has never really done that. Now's the time. There is a law that has been introduced previously called the Disclose Act. It's a very good one. Some tweaking needed, but that is another thing. Electoral reform, absolutely number one.
Excellent. Chuck?
Well, yeah, on a similar point, I would say electoral issues are important, but I would put a slightly different spin on it. Some of the things Rich is talking about, I think, are difficult. You know, what does it mean? How do you define voter suppression? I mean, we kind of know what it looks like. It walks like a duck, et cetera. But actually putting that into legislation would be hard. On the other hand, I think that the most important thing is to create national standards for federal elections regarding all of the issues that have come up in this election: early voting, mail voting, how votes are counted, who supervises the elections. Now, the Constitution does say that the states, the legislatures of the state determine, at least for the presidential election, how electors are to be determined. But I think, as Rich says, there would be ways to create these national standards so that you don't have, one state or one county saying we can't count the mail votes until 7 o'clock on election day, and other states say we can start counting them 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time as they come in. We don't disclose, we don't count them, we process them. And then the computer spits out a number on election day, so that you avoid a lot of this delay and red mirages and blue mirages and all the rest of that stuff. And you set up strict standards for how you do mail-in voting and who gets to supervise things and so on. And you don't leave it to the partisan elected local officials who are subject to mischief. And although a lot of the Republicans in this cycle certainly stood up to a lot of pressure, but you kind of depoliticize it. You set national standards. You have perhaps some kind of a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission that is in control of determining how votes get counted. I think if you deal with the voting issues, that's the heart of the big lie. The big lie was that there was all of this voter fraud and that ballot boxes were stuffed and dead people voted and fill in the blank. My dog voted and so on. If you have national standards on that, of course, some people on the fringe will still make those arguments, but they'll be much harder to sustain.
Okay, thank you all. This has been excellent. And I'm going to turn it.
I don't get my minute.
You already had your minute.
I have my minute.
Listen, we have a whole bunch of questions. I've been trying to group them together, but I think just given we were just talking about voter suppression, I'm recalling my neighbor's pickup truck where he's written in on the back, "Thank you, Stacey Abrams," which goes right into this question here. And Rich, I'm going to toss this one to you. This is from Cedric Page. He says, "What can be done beyond the efforts of Stacey Abrams to increase the franchise for an increasingly diverse electorate?" What do you think about that? Oh, you're muted, Rich.
Okay, one of the main things that can be done is automatic voter registration. It's been applied in some states. It's tremendously successful. The Brennan, if anyone's looking for it, look up in the Brennan Center for Justice, automatic voter registration. That is number one, how you do it. You avoid all the registration garbage that occurs, all the questions about it. If you've got a driver's license, you're registered, period. That's number one. I do think the national standards idea is an excellent one that can be laid out, but I think you do have to go beyond that and have a congressional statute that prevents the malicious anti-democratic efforts that will be made to suppress votes. I think that has to come from Congress while Congress has the ability to do it.
Let's,
What does anybody think about the issue of mandatory voting? There are a lot of democracies around the world that have mandatory voting.
Let me speak to that quick, Chuck. Belgium has had mandatory voting since 1898. They have the lowest citizen participation interest and the lowest citizen participation throughout most of the world, certainly Europe. I gave a talk in Renaissance on democracy last year, and mandatory voting, I examined it. I think it's a terrible, terrible idea. That actually, and not that you had a terrible idea, it's been talked about as a good thing, but I think it actually causes citizens to not care about their government far more. It becomes a duty, like you gotta go, do this and that and the other, as opposed to something you should feel proud about and go do. And the automatic voter registration is an alternative to that, and it absolutely dramatically increases the number of people who vote.
let's flip and talk about pardons just for a little bit more. I'm recalling a podcast I heard a couple of weeks ago of Gerald Ford, issuing the pardon to President Nixon because it was the right thing to do to take, the spotlight off of a former president and keep moving forward. Is it in President Biden's interest, and Todd, maybe I'll throw this one to you, is it in President Biden's interest, and obviously we have a Senate trial coming up, but following that trial, let's say that they don't convict, would it be in the interest of President Biden to offer President Trump a pardon for crimes he may have committed while president?
I have no idea which way the political dice would roll on that, but I think, rather than my opinion, it's very interesting the way that Biden himself has been handling that issue indirectly or asking others to do it for him, which is how do you balance this need to go forward versus not? But here there was a judgment about Nixon that Watergate was something very specific about criminal acts that the president had committed. Here you're talking about a much broader phenomenon of political subversion, and I'm not sure that's what in effect a pardon would sweep it under the rug in order to say we're going to move forward is actually the situation. But since I have the mic, I'm gonna give my 1 minute thing because it fits right in with this actually, which was rather than taking a little bit of a different tack from our lawyers and judges and the political legal approach, there's one of principle, and I think as long as Biden and the people in his administration continue to do what their orientation is, which is to flip the big lie on its head. So, Reich Minister Goebbels' famous quote is, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. That's the core of the big lie as a principle. Flip it on its head. If you tell the truth enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And I think that opposing principle has a lot to advise it as speak for it as a way to go ahead.
Thank you. And that just reminds me of the article that Timothy Snyder published last week in the New York Times called An American Abyss. If you haven't read it, do yourself a favor, read it. It's fantastic. It talks all about the big lie and the breakers and the gamers in the Republican Party. It's really quite a compelling analysis. Chuck, let me throw this question to you on pardons, and we'll move on from pardons. And this is something I had no idea about. And this is from Spencer Ralston. He says, I understand that Trump can pardon persons in secret. So he could decide to prospectively pardon say his family and himself and Rudy and Steve Bannon in secret, and we wouldn't know about it at all until one of them were to be charged with a crime, and then they showed they had a pardon. Is that true?
Well, I saw that question when I was scrolling through the questions. The answer is I don't know, but I also don't think that the pardon clause in the Constitution has any requirement of publicity associated with it, at least not in the Constitution. It would seem to me that it would be possible for Congress to pass a law that would say, we're not telling you who you can pardon and so on and so forth, but if you pardon somebody, it's only effective if it is disclosed publicly within X days or hours of having been made. I'm not aware that there is any such law. So I guess that's possible. And as I say, it's in the nature of an affirmative defense, so that you don't know. Mm-hmm. Some U.S. Attorney puts together a case against Steve Bannon, which they're already doing, and they bring the indictment and they say, "How do you plead?" And he said, "Well, it doesn't really matter how I plead. Here's my pardon," and he holds it up. That would be an interesting question to decide. And there was another question on pardons that said, "Is there really no law against paying for a pardon?" And as far as I know, and I've read, there hasn't been any allegation that Trump has been paid directly for a pardon, but that lawyers and lobbyists and people who sell their access to Trump have been getting paid by potential pardonees, saying, pay me $1 million and I can't guarantee, but I'll talk to the president about this. And I'm not sure there's anything illegal about that, unless it's some kind of a bribery scheme that you can come up with, as opposed to simply paying for a service. But it certainly gets close to a line, it seems to me. But I'm not aware that there's been any accusation of Trump getting paid.
Yeah, and basically the law would be bribery. It's if you say, "Hey, I'll pay you $1 million for this official action," that is a bribery.
Right,
so that's how it would have to come in. But then it is a criminal law. You do have to fall within the confines of bribery, etc.
But if you pay Rudy $1 million because Rudy says Trump thinks I'm the greatest guy in the world,
and then Rudy goes and talks to him. Yeah.
But if you pay Rudy or pick somebody else, you pay Jay Sekulow $1 million as a fee, and his fee agreement is, I'll go talk to the president and see if you can get pardoned. The president's not being bribed under those circumstances, unless there's a kickback and you can prove that Sekulow shares some of the money with Trump as part of the deal.
I do want to take a little bit of paranoia off the tables. There's so much out there. The idea of a secret pardon that he could make that comes out later. We will have tomorrow a different president, and a pardon is an official record. I doubt very much that secret pardons would remain secret very long.
That's good news. Let's go to the events of January 6th one more time. And Todd, let me ask you this. I actually have a current question and a latter-day question. How close did we come to a situation for President Trump to execute the Insurrection Act, with the result of the suspension of habeas corpus, imposition of martial law, and suspension of Congress? That's question one. And question two is, how does this insurrection of January 6th compare to the storming of the Winter Palace in Petrograd in November of 1917?
Yeah, well, now we're getting into my territory. Insurrection Act, that would be another one of those, unbelievable, like the members of Congress who were objecting to the certification of the election, which in effect was objecting to their own election because they were on the same ballot, right? So President Trump would invoke the Insurrection Act over the seizure of the Capitol by insurrectionists who were supporting him. Right. So, but the other thing that occurs to me about that is, especially in the fact that the Insurrection Act would also allow mobilization of the U.S. Of the American military forces to suppress the insurrection, that they would be very well put in a position to refuse to obey what they would determine to be an illegal order, which was very interesting. The Nancy Pelosi call with Chief of Staff Mark Milley about the use of the nuclear codes was very, that was the signal that she was giving, seeking his reassurance that Trump, in a moment of madness, would not be able to launch a nuclear war as sort of the ultimate distraction. I think you can apply the same thing. 1917, that's a very interesting question for comparative history or a counterfactual. I'll just go back to the original analysis. The Bolsheviks, and the others who participated had a very clear objective, which was to overthrow the czar, not keep the czar in power. So different situation there. But they were also had, remember Vladimir Lenin was put in a secret train from Switzerland, from the Swiss border across Germany to Russia by the Germans. So he had critical foreign assistance in sparking that event, at least making him present for that event. So I think that the differences in cause, aim, coherence, and unity all would fail on the Capitol seizure. And there, go back to the analogy, the picture of the guy with the horns, his helmet, and the guy sitting with his feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. These people were clueless. They truly were lumpen, whereas the seizure in 1917, these were committed and intent revolutionaries.
So there was a great piece in the Washington Post yesterday that is a 14-minute digital forensics of what happened on January 6th. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And my favorite part of it is it has the man you just referenced, the QAnon shaman, walking at a leisurely pace into the Senate gallery before he takes the dice. It's compelling viewing for all the wrong reasons. But that's a great segue into this week. Obviously, we're all focused on the inauguration tomorrow and what may happen not only in DC, but at state capitals across the country during the inauguration. But we have a trial that's going to happen in the Senate. And so, Rich, let me ask you this. Is the trial an opportunity to look at the events of what happened as opposed to just determining whether Trump is in fact guilty? Does the trial present us with some interesting possibilities for healing, for understanding, and even for reconciliation, or would it be more punitive in nature?
I think it is an opportunity in between. I don't know how healing it would be so much as, and I don't think punitive. I do think, and I saw Herb's question about, is it fact-finding? Yes, this is an opportunity for the facts to come out in a very not controlled, well, it would be controlled, but a very organized setting with Adam Schiff and others presenting the evidence over and over, repeat in order to get the message across. And one interesting thing that will happen as well is the past weekend, there were to be demonstrations, riots, whatever, throughout the state capitals. That didn't happen. That in itself points to Trump and his people having instigated January 6th. Without that instigation for the capitals this past weekend, it didn't happen. Obviously, the social media shutdowns and everything else also took place. But I think there will be a lot of focus on not just Trump, but those who facilitated and called for those insurrections to occur, including the Republican Association of Attorney Generals, and including the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, having encouraged the MAGA folks to, I can't recall how she said it, but it's veering towards do the right thing, stand up. As we have many people that are not the mopes that Todd is talking about, who were instrumental in January 6th occurring as it did. And there does need to be an accounting and that educational opportunity. I think that's the appropriate thing. It's an educational opportunity, not so much for healing, not so much for punitive, but to educate the public.
I couldn't agree more. So we're a little bit over time, but why don't we close with each of you offering us 1 minute of something you're feeling optimistic about for Biden's administration or something you're looking forward to. Obviously, the way we consume news is about to change drastically, and we're not going to have these amazing, did that just happen set of moments. But why don't we start? Why don't we go around the table? Todd, I'm looking at you first. Why don't you offer us with 1 minute of what you're looking forward to in with this incoming new administration?
I think there's no question that the better angels have arrived, and that's pretty much everybody in this cabinet. So when I talk next week, I'll be focusing on the foreign policy and national security implications of that. So my one thing, being from California, I'm allowed to be an optimist, is to say that I actually think that much of the world is going to rally to the Trump administration, that the naysayers have been and said, nobody can trust America again. I don't think that's true as much for anything else, because Angela Merkel and company have been holding up the fort, and they're going to welcome America back, and people don't have anywhere else to go. The United States still has 28 NATO allies and 50 non-NATO allies. China, the competitor that everybody's pointing to, has one, and it's North Korea. So that's my take on where this is, the thing to look up to.
And let's go to Rich. Rich, what are you most anticipating when it comes to this new administration?
Well, day by day, calm. But the thing I'm looking for mostly is true structural reform. And I do see some signs that the administration recognizes that need. And, it's got to be done soon. I was just reading in Obama's book, Rahm Emanuel's comment, that the presidency is like a new car. It depreciates as soon as you drive it off the lot. He has a short time to get things done, he and his administration, and I'm hopeful that they will really look at some structural reforms, including like the new ethics laws standards that were announced this morning.
Chuck, over to you for your minute of anticipation.
Well, I think the primary thing is the fact that the adults are back and that you have competence in the administration that's been proposed. You don't have, head scratchers like, what is Wilbur Ross doing there, or Betsy DeVos, or Rex Tillerson? I'm thinking about, the first cabinet, or Steve Mnuchin. I mean, Steve Mnuchin was a movie producer, basically, was his primary background. Now you have people that actually know what they're talking about. And you may not agree with everybody. But there are adults in the room now, and not everything will be viewed through a political lens, which it has been for the last 4 years. Every issue, every person, every thought has been viewed by the current administration through a political lens. And that's just not going to be the way it is. And I think that's very much a step in the right direction.
Yeah, having the smart people making decisions as opposed to the ideologues has got to be a huge step forward. Vicki, I'm going to turn to you for your minute and for any final words that you may want to share with us.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. And I would hope that the Biden administration does some of the things that have been suggested here this morning. Electoral reform, looking at social media, which we haven't talked about so much, but it's really important. What I am most looking forward to, though, on the optimistic side, is I'm going to get my vaccine. You're going to get your vaccine, and the Democratic administration under Biden and Harris are going to successfully conquer this pandemic and make us ready for future ones.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for this. It's always fascinating to hear your thoughts as we kind of go behind the headlines and explore this fascinating moment in time. So thank you, Todd, and good evening to you. And thank you, Rich, and thank you, Chuck. And of course, thank you, Vicki, so much.
Thank
Thanks
you,
all.
Edward.
And we'll see you all on Thursday morning when, of course, we're going to get into what in the world happened to to U.S. diplomats and Canadian diplomats in Cuba and in China. It's going to be a fascinating one. And until then, have a great day. Enjoy winter, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye, everyone.